Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. I'm Brandon, and I'm here to share things that interest me and things that I think the Lord has brought to my attention. This is episode number 121, and today I had a fun conversation with my friend Diego Mera. We'll talk a bit about our relationship and how we became friends, but the one reason I thought this would be a fun conversation is that I consider myself a follower of Jesus and therefore a Christian, while Diego considers himself an atheist and an ex-Christian. And despite that significant difference, we found a great value in our mutual relationship. I'd never actually spent much time talking with Diego about his religious history, and so this seemed like the perfect topic. So call this episode, if you want, Finding Common Ground with My Atheist Friend. By the time we're done, I think you'll see that we actually agree on a lot more than we disagree on, and even our points of disagreement are not points of dispute, but instead points of mutual growth. So sit back and enjoy our conversation. Well, hi, Diego. I wanted to thank you for agreeing to talk with me tonight. I've been friends with you for quite a long time, and we don't have to go through the whole history, but I think I've known you at least 15 years, if not longer. We originally were workers on some similar programs at different sites, but we came together for job stuff, and so we got a lot of chance to get to know each other outside the religious space long before we started talking about anything having to do with religion.
Right.
And my recollection is that we actually started talking about that not too long before 2020, when you were posting some things and I was pushing back as a bona fide Republican, but hopefully in a gentle way. And I think we
Yes.
started to discover some common ground, even though we discovered we were different in some ways. So
Right.
for a while, you were one of the token Democrats in my life, and that was a challenge to me. And well, here I find myself now on a completely different track than I had been, but still friends. And so
hmm
uh, I guess one of the reasons I want to talk to you tonight is because we know that we're very different in our religious outlooks, but we have been in relationship over religious things for quite some time now. And I thought it would be fascinating to have a conversation that other people could listen in on, because most of the time it's just us or our friends and family.
Right.
So in this case, I just like to get to know you a bit better, even in some questions that I've never asked you before, and
hmm
see what makes you tick. And in return, of course, you have the opportunity to come back at me with the same kinds of questions.
Sure.
So to start off with, part of the vibe here was, of course, a conversation between someone who considers themselves Christian and someone who considers themselves not. And
Right.
in your case, at least agnostic, if not atheist. And you kind of seem to bounce around there a little bit. So I thought I'd start off with some definitions so we can get some common ground on what we mean. So how would you define atheist and then agnostic?
Okay. So one of the things I learned actually through you is that that word has changed throughout history, and which I found fascinating. In this particular case, the way that I would define it is a person that does not believe in God or an afterlife. And when I say doesn't believe, um, it's because it's more like there isn't, to me, verifiable or enough evidence to convince me of that. It doesn't mean, however, that I'm saying that I'm opposed to the idea that it could exist. I'm saying for me, there's not enough evidence for it to be the case. But in no way am I saying that I am concluding, definitively that there isn't a God or an afterlife. It's just, again, so that's the definition like of an atheist. An agnostic would be, from my perspective, someone who believes in a higher power, but not the kind of God that most people, I guess, when they grow up, believe in a like an individual. I wouldn't say an individual, but I think you know what I mean, like a power, but nothing defined as
Yeah.
right. And to go a little further, I guess, with the other religions, when it comes to Christianity or a Muslim, in particular with Christianity, there's the whole thing of a personal relationship with God. Um, but like Christians, as we'll probably get into, are not all the same, just like atheists are not all the same either. So I hope sort of that answers the question
Yeah.
about my definition of atheist.
How would you define religion?
Oh, that one is hard because I don't, just about anything can be called a religion. Um, one of the things I'm finding difficult too is a lot of people call a lot of religions cults, for instance, and exactly where is that break point? And many times, when I see people calling something a cult, I'm like, I don't think that's a cult. But so the same way with exactly what is religion. Um, to me, it's no different than just like a belief system, really. It's what it comes down to it.
I think I sent you a link probably last week to a podcast that one of the things they were talking about is the idea that a religion is whatever defines itself as religion,
Mhm.
which
Right,
was a fascinating circular definition on purpose from their
right,
point of view. They acknowledged that it was, and they said that it's very hard to define what is religion because
uh
if you look at, say, a Christian as opposed to someone who's a Confucianist,
right,
very, very different sets of practices and thought processes. And one has nothing to do with thinking, one has to do with how you act, the other has
right.
to do with how you think.
Hmm.
Christians, a lot of Christians tend to think it's about what you believe, other
Hmm.
Christians tend to think it's about how you act. And so
Yes,
both are valid
or,
definitions.
or even a combination of both.
Sure.
Doesn't have to be one. Yeah, absolutely.
So I would define atheist in my background understanding would be that it would be someone who I think disbelieves in God more than doesn't believe in God, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Yes.
And an agnostic would be someone who uh, decides that they can't know for sure. And I think most atheists would probably say that they're agnostic in the sense that they've concluded there's not sufficient evidence
Hmm.
to believe in God.
Hmm.
Um, I think those definitions are almost as fuzzy as when you get into defining religion
Right.
because everybody has their own sense of what it means. And so you
Hmm.
kind of have to be humble enough to ask each person you're talking to, well, what do you mean by that?
Right. And something else too, as you bring this up, is that you can have an atheist that will tell you, like, like they know for a fact, like they know that there isn't. Just like there are Christians who will say, they know for a fact that there is a God and there is an afterlife. So again, it's like just variations. It really is dependent on, I think, the individual, very much so.
I think what I'm picking up on here is that there's a need for, well, it goes back to something I've been thinking a lot about over the last couple of years is a need for certainty. I have to have a
Yes.
definition that
Hmm.
gives me a box in which I can work with confidence in my own heart,
Yep.
whether it is I believe this is true or I choose to believe that it's not true. Um, and I guess one of the things that surprised me that I heard probably in the last year was the idea that a lot of people who go through deconstruction or reconstructing their faith or picking apart the things that they were raised with is arriving at a sense of agnosticism about Christianity, even though they consider themselves a Jesus follower and
Hmm.
therefore a Christian.
Yes.
But they acknowledge, no, we can't know a lot of these things for certain, but we believe them because of our experiences.
Hmm.
Okay, that's interesting to call a Christian an agnostic and be okay with that because that kind of breaks a lot of molds that in the evangelical world that I was raised were absolutely, you know, light years apart.
Right.
So, speaking of that, you were once part of an evangelical church, was it?
Yeah, so I think it'd be kind of interesting to go through the history of where I started and where I am now. I think I can pretty much summarize it somewhat. So, growing up, I went to a Catholic church to the point
Hmm.
where I was an altar boy. I went through communion, so I was exposed to church by my parents while we went. However, I think when we moved around, it kind of got lost in that. So then we started going to church kind of sporadically. How I felt about it at the time, I wouldn't say that I was um, believing, not believing. I don't know. It's honestly thinking back on it, it's like just something you did. Like when I went to school, you just learned something. I would say that the turning point for me as a teenager, as I grew, to watch things was I would say Cosmos. Cosmos was probably the single thing back then that
The Carl
started
Sagan
to,
show?
yeah, the Carl Sagan, right, documentary. And I think one of the things to this day I remember, he was saying that, well, if you look at the start of the universe, and you say, hey, um, what started it, and you say, well, it was always there. Then the question of God, well, where did God come from? And the answer is, well, God was always there. You can just save a step. That statement, I mean, there's a lot to it, but it influenced me quite a bit in the way I thought about things. But anyway, going forward, I would say that I became more and more the kind of believer, like actually the kind of atheist I explained at first. It's like I came to conclude, actually conclude there's no God. Not that I don't think there is, but just that conclusion. And kind of remained this way until probably 1993. 1993 was a huge pivotal time in my life, and I was going through some things, and there were two couples, Christian couples, that came to our home to like minister to my wife and I. And I found them to be incredibly kind. And they talked to me about the gospel, and I listened. And not to blame it on circumstance, because I was, like I said, going through some things. But there were a couple things that were going on. Let me go back to something else too. Around this time, I was at work, and I was talking to a coworker, and she said to me, "Hey, you don't believe in that evolution nonsense, do you?" And my first thought actually was to say to her, "Well, you don't believe in that God nonsense, do you?" But before I did so, at least I'm glad I caught myself. I was thinking to myself, you know what? She doesn't know anything about evolution. You could tell just by talking. And then I thought to myself, well, what do you know about the Bible? What do you know about any of this? And at the time that one of that Christian couple had given me a Bible, and so I decided, you know what? I'm just going to read it. And it took about 2 years, and I read the whole thing. And that, coupled with a lot of discussions I was having with them, I got to the point where you say the prayer of accepting Jesus Christ, and I did this, and I felt that, I think once I said, you know what, this kind of makes sense to me, because it did at the time. It made sense to me, and so I sincerely accepted it, and I said, okay, I'm a Christian, and I'm going to do what Christians do. So you go to church, you go to Sunday school. And something for me too I found was I love Sunday school even more than church itself. I felt that's where discussion was had. That's where you talk to other people. It wasn't just someone, talking to you. Yeah, exactly. Um, and in addition to something else that happened, as the years went by, we moved to many churches. And when I mean many, I remember belonged to a Methodist church. Then we went to a Baptist church. We moved to a Presbyterian church. Went to a non-denominational church. I think we must have gone to 6 or 7 different denominational churches. And each time that I went, I saw the similarities and the differences. And something also that happened around this time was a very good friend of mine. He was teaching a class on he was a younger creationist, meaning that, thinking that the earth and the universe was only like 5,000 years old, 5 to 10,000. And, I'm sitting here in his class, and, I find it hard to accept what he was saying. But one of the things about him that I saw was that he was sincere in what he was seeking. And I think he saw within me too, that as we talked, there was a level of respect where we had these differences, but I saw him searching for the truth. And so we bonded over that. We became friends over that. And that was important too, because I saw that, like I said, not all Christians are the same. You have the ones that talk about fire and brimstone, and those others that don't. And so I never thought of any Christian as the same. If I came across another Christian across the country, I'm not going to assume that he believes or thinks the same way as the other guy. So I saw a lot of caring. I saw a lot of, these kinds of things. However, you also saw the other side. And to make a point about that, I remember distinctly I was at a Latter-day Saints church, and part of the reason is, I went to that church too. There was a time I only visited, but I went. And I'll never forget this. This guy goes up and says his testimony. And he says, when somebody tells you, because one of the things they always say is they do a prayer and they say, I know this church is true. And so he said, if anybody tells you otherwise, or somebody tries to talk to you, against our beliefs, you just don't listen to them. And that was interesting to me because I thought to myself, well, if you are like really believing what you believe, you should be able to defend it. That you would just systematically say, I'm not going to, I'm just going to push that away. I thought, just didn't sound right to me. However, uh, you know, I thought about why would somebody say that, and honestly, I think that there's good reason as well. And I give you a perfect example of what I mean. So now here I am a Christian, and that friend of mine that I was talking about, a new pastor came into the church, and he started preaching about loving, and caring for gay and lesbian couples, and same-sex unions and things like this. I remember at the time saying, well, hey, the Bible is saying this. And my friend and I both sort of tag teamed. We started emailing back and forth and saying how could you be saying this? You're the pastor of the church. And what I realized later is, in a way, I was becoming like that Pharisee. I was looking at the rules. I was not looking at people as people. And, that's something I realized at the time. But looking back on it, I feel quite ashamed, actually, of that thinking. Unbeknownst to me, my daughter, who came out as lesbian later, I can't imagine, at that time I was talking to this pastor. And by the way, this pastor left the church. And I think part of the reason why, not because of us, but reactions by myself like that and some others, I don't think it lasted a year.
Very common, though.
Yeah, exactly. So I realized, if my daughter had come to me at that time, I would have been like, see, so there's where I'm talking about how when somebody says, hey, be careful with the groups you join and that kind of thing. Well, here's an example of something that I myself, as I took it and I'm thinking, hey, this is positive and this is going to be beneficial. I was an instrument of, in essence, harming someone else with
Sure, yeah.
with my judgment, with my condemnation, that kind of thing. So that was something that didn't hit me until later, but that was somewhat important. So then I moved down here to Florida, and I was still going to church every week, and again, I was involved in small groups. And what I think for me, as I went through all of this, is, like I said before, I found people to be kind and thoughtful. And then you find some that are not. They're very closed off. But what I think I'm able to do is not to judge the entire group by the actions of just one individual or even a group of individuals. So I've always been open-minded to talking to anybody about anything. Now, around 2010 or something of this nature, I began. There were so many things that I couldn't reconcile. Some of them, mostly in Genesis. So the flood, the creation of the universe, of man, and of these things. And going back to that class I was talking about with young Earth creationists. It's one of those things where I started to see it in terms of like. Not analogies, but what's the word where, well, you're not taking it literal, right?
Yeah.
So Noah's flood, well, that was a local
Not
flood,
force.
not a world, even the whole thing of Adam and Eve, biting from the apple. That to me would be where humans gain consciousness of right and wrong, because he even says in the Bible, what was the difference after they ate of the apple? They learned right and wrong. Well, a dog doesn't know right from wrong. Only a human does, because a human can process that. So
Let me ask a question before you go any further.
mhm.
It seems to me like you had an experience of reading the Bible with very little background training. You
Hmm.
just decided, I want to read this thing. And
Yep.
so you studied it for yourself without a whole lot of catechesis. Is that how you say the word in the Catholic Church? Or
I,
catechesis?
I don't know what
Having
my
gone
so.
through the
Mhm.
catechism and being told how to think about things.
Right. Right.
So when you then encountered people telling you what the Bible said in a very different context or in
Hmm.
a specific religious context, you were like, but it doesn't really say that. I think that was probably part of what opened your eyes at some level is like, this is, I'm not reading it the same.
Right.
Or I think most people that are embedded in a single church culture for most of their lives grow up so, I hate to, it sounds bad, but the word indoctrinated kind of makes sense. You've been
Hmm.
given doctrine of how to think about certain things, and you
Right.
don't really think to wonder, is that what it really says?
Right.
But it sounds like you approached it from a different direction. So,
Hmm. And I think that the way I approach it after I went back to being an atheist, I to me it was a great experience actually. Those 20 years or so that I was a Christian, I learned just so much about people. I learned about, you know, like the idea of me sitting down and at least talking to you to understand where you're coming from. I don't have to agree with you, but I can at least, at the bare minimum, understand
mhm.
where you're coming from. Um, and so, going back to though, not being able to reconcile a lot of this stuff at the beginning of the Bible, and then just a series of things that I just, predestination, things of that nature. It just got to the point where I just couldn't
They
believe
just
anymore.
they didn't
Hmm.
fit together.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, uh, but I had built so many friends. I have friends to this day from 15, 18 years ago, Christian friends. I have friends who were Christian and became atheists. I'm still friends with them. So one of the things I found is that when I go talk to someone, I also go to the Latter Day Saints church because my mother and sister belong to the Latter Day Saints. So the thing is that I am surrounded by people with different beliefs, and I felt that instead of saying, well, I'm just going to reject everything and reject these people, I interact with them, so I'm going to interact with them. And I found that I can talk as an atheist, I can talk to someone who's a believer, and I know where you're coming from. I've
Mhm.
read the passages you have, I've been to sermons, I've listened to the same thing you have. So I'm not quick, to say to you, oh, I think that's ridiculous, or you're weak-minded. If anything, a lot of people that I know, most of them are Christian because in this country that's the dominating thing. No, they're not dumb or stupid at all. They're um, rational. They think a lot of things. So um, I definitely stopped from calling any one group good or bad. It's more like on an individual basis, which, well, we can talk later about religion as a whole or group of people as a whole, but it's important, at least from my point of view, that the individual, is very important to me. So talk about judgment. Somebody comes and says, like you're around them and you see them lie, for you to say, hey, you're a liar. I mean, imagine that you've only met them one time. Yes, let's say you even caught them in a lie. That doesn't mean they're a liar.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? So I'm not quick to judge when it comes to whatever belief system you have, and that helps because I used to be, you know, a Christian.
Which is interesting because a lot of Christians would take the exact opposite approach because they feel like there's even though the verse says judge not lest you be judged,
Hmm.
there's also verses that say you have to judge rightly,
Hmm.
discerning between good and evil
Right.
and so forth. And so a lot of people will take and run with one of those two extremes, and either refuse to judge or be very happy to call out everything that they see wrong with a situation and a person.
Hmm.
Um, I guess that's the diversity issue right there, right?
Right. Right.
You could spend way too much energy trying to pin something down.
Hmm.
I guess that comes with what you were raised in. You know, this is the way to think about faith and the Bible and religion, or no, that's not. This is instead.
Right. Um, One thing I want to bring up, because I guess the idea of what people think of atheists, I pretty much know what a lot of people think of Christians, but this idea that if you become an atheist, like you don't have morals, or what is your, where's your base? What is important? Like if you don't believe that there's an afterlife and when you die you're gone, like what purpose is there in life? And what I have found is the complete opposite. Like for me, the finality of death is what gives me meaning to this life, and more so, there's something I guess specific I want to speak to. It was with my daughter's girlfriend, fiance now, and she was saying, I look at what has gone on. In order for me to meet Amanda, I had to, this had to happen and this had to happen in this particular sequence, and if any of that didn't happen, then we wouldn't be together. And by the way, I'm not at all dissing anything she's saying at all, but it made me think, right? That so in her mind, and there's nothing wrong with it. She's thinking, well, something or some force or maybe God or something, put that together for them to be together.
Mm-hmm.
And I really thought about that for a second, and I thought to myself, you know what? What if if my parents had not divorced, because they divorced? What if they had not divorced, or my wife's parents had not divorced? My wife and I would never have met. We couldn't have met. I mean, you can make the case that, some other way we would have met. But just thinking in the sense of what had to happen, well, I think what would have happened is I would have been in another city. That's the reason why I wouldn't have met her. And I would have met some other woman, and I may have been married to that woman. And then 37 years later, I'd be sitting there contemplating, thinking, it's amazing that I met, yeah, exactly, this current wife, and look how amazing it is, And I would have thought, hey, what would have happened if my parents had gotten divorced, right? And the thing about it is, I lived that life, right? So I would be there. I could be thinking that, hey, this is ordained or this is constructed, but instead, I don't have that life. I have this life. And so for me, now this life has even greater meaning to me because this is the way it turned out. Not because it was manipulated, not manipulated, but
ordained.
Yeah, exactly. This is the way things fell. This is where things are, and so I cherish this. And I'm sure that if I was married to some other woman, I'd be sharing. I'd be, that would be really important to me, just like her husband would probably be important to her. And along those lines, that got me to thinking about something else as well, and that is, I know this may sound corny or it may sound obvious, but to me it isn't. So I realize that whether you're a theist or an atheist, I think we can both agree on this next thing I'm going to say, and that is, let's suppose, for a minute, right, as an atheist, there is no afterlife, and the universe started 14 billion years ago. The idea that 14 billion years has passed, and here we are, though, in this exact second, right? So whatever has happened amounts to this moment in the history of the universe. When I stop and think about it, it is I don't know, it's astounding to me. So you go back and you look at anybody you want to talk about, Napoleon, Caesar, these famous people, however famous they are, whatever they did, they're gone. They are no longer breathing. You could say they're in an afterlife, but they're not in this life. But I am. You are. And the other thing that to me is really important is the importance of this very second. So whoever watches this video, to them, it's like their future, right? This is our present. But like things have already happened, and the best way to say it is the future doesn't exist because it hasn't happened yet. So it
Okay.
doesn't exist. And the past also does no longer exist. It's past. So the only thing that exists is the now. And that's what I'm saying, how if you think about it, out of all history, everything comes to this exact moment. And so for me, that it again, it goes like, hey, you want to find purpose in life? The purpose of life is life. Here we are. This is it. So there's that for me. And I was going to say that as a theist, if you think about that too, right? Let's say so you believe in God, and I don't say you. I mean anybody who's listening who does. So think about that. You talk about there's a plan. Well, think about the awesomeness of that. You are part of that timeline of that plan. Even if Jesus comes back 100 years from now, 1,000, and you're not going to be alive here on earth, you're still in that timeline. And so I guess I'm trying to point out that to me, whether you're theist or an atheist, the now is in and of itself, like it just has great meaning for me is what I'm saying.
Okay, so the question I think would typically get raised, and it's curious in my mind then, is what's the motivation to not be hedonistic or live the now solely for oneself as opposed to for the betterment of the people around us? Because you are fundamentally good to the people around you. So there's obviously something in you that says the now matters to the people around me and not just me.
Yes. Right.
What is that maybe a remnant of your Christian upbringing, or is that inherent to the now?
Yeah, and this is the reason why I don't regret my time as a Christian. So even though I don't believe in those things, one thing I do believe in is I was definitely influenced by it. I was influenced by them. I was influenced by my mother and father. I'm currently influenced by my mother and sister who belong to the Latter-day Saints Church. I whenever I go to see them and it's a Sunday, I will gladly go with them. I'm not going to say, oh, no, I don't believe in that. No, I gladly go. I will stay longer. I said I like Sunday school, so I'll sit in on it and listen. I learned a lot just from listening. So, do
you think any benefits accrue to us in a tangible sense for being good to others?
Absolutely. So, your question about, what makes me not do other things. Honestly, if I jump off this roof and I fall and I get hurt, I don't want to get hurt. If I hurt other people, I've seen the damage that does. I don't. So the things that I take away from being a Christian, someone could ask me, well, the Bible, right? What's important to you there? Well, I may not believe in the Bible as a whole, but like the Book of Job, I learned so many things from the Book of Job. The New Testament, if you read, where at least Jesus Christ talked about loving others, come into contact with others that are not, the best of people. One thing I remember once somebody saying is the reason why only the righteous can go to heaven is because God cannot have evil in his presence. And that to me doesn't make sense. If God is omnipotent, what do you mean? I mean, Jesus Christ himself, approached those that were, these things. So it's things like that, by the way, that, in my head, I couldn't reconcile. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me.
I used to believe that. I think I see it differently now in the sense that, like, I think you watched the video that I talked to Paul and Billy Horde about contamination and how the presence of God coming into a situation
Yes.
fundamentally changes the situation as opposed to being changed by it. But
right.
I think as far as the evil in God's presence, I think we misunderstood that to be about polluting God when in fact it was about, I think a better understanding from a Christian point of view ought to be God is concerned for our ability to not be hurt by the purity and the purifying fire
Hmm.
of bringing sin into the presence of such righteousness that it would get burned out of us. And so that's a very different take than I think a lot of Christians have. One kind of is worried about God, and the other is worried about God's effect on us.
Hmm.
And so, at the moment, I'm not a believer in the doctrine of hell and eternal damnation for sin. I think the whole idea of punishing fire or purifying fire in the New Testament is more about God getting rid of the stuff in us that shouldn't be there so that we are fully whole and complete.
Hmm.
And, then we really interact well together. We interact well with God, and we're not kept from being free and liberated in God's presence, whatever that turns out to be.
Hmm.
And I
Wait,
don't even really necessarily think of God quite the same way I used to, as being this personalized character with a particular unique identity that
right.
interacts with us like a person does. I think that's a facile way, an easy way of conceptualizing God, but it's probably too simplistic to
Hmm.
really comprehend the totality of what God is and could be.
Right.
And I think understanding God at much a higher level requires us, like Richard Rohr talks about a lot of these things, getting outside of that idea of God as a vending machine that we put prayers into and get good things out of. And
Right.
we get to go to
But
heaven if we say the right things. And,
yeah.
it's much more of this all infusing, all encompassing, all purifying presence that eventually will transform us into something much higher. I think that's something that appeals to me from what I see the Bible saying when you strip away all the stuff I was told it said.
Hmm.
So,
I also want to mention a very good friend of mine. We've been friends now for almost over 30 years, and she was also instrumental in this thing. We talked a lot. I mean, a lot about everything. We still do. However, the thing was, she didn't read the Bible. She only read parts of it. And I remember one time I said this to her. I said, you are the most Christian, unchristian person that I know. And yeah, and she still is, by the way. And the reason why I say that is because, as we talked, she focused on like Jesus' behavior, not from, hey, look what it says in the text in terms of, a legalistic kind of a thing. And what I notice about her is that even though she does not believe in, she's agnostic, right? She doesn't believe in the God of the Bible, but her behavior and how she thinks, how she processes, is to me Jesus-like.
mhm.
So, a question is, hey, what makes a Christian? To me, it's not whether or not I was the Pharisee that I was, about, gays should not be this and that. It's, are you treating other people with respect? Are you treating them the way you would want to be treated? So forth and so on. And I saw that within her, and she was not a Christian. See, so then I question, hey, what is it to actually be a Christian? What does that mean? And so for me, the focus was on the New Testament, you know, Jesus' behavior. And I think that translated later when I said, well, I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in this. But you know what? Here's the thing, right? They talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Well, I didn't want to throw out the baby from the things that I learned from being a Christian. And at the same time realizing that there is dirty bathwater in there. And I'm not going to say there isn't, but I can accept both, that there's good and bad, without saying, well, I'm going to totally reject this because of this. And by the way, I go on atheist websites where I read conversations. I've gone to websites where Latter-day Saints, former ones and current ones, and I look at the discussion. So when I see these atheists, right, and they are hurt because a lot of them came from some church environment, and they can say, "Hey, I was treated this way," or
There's a
I was
wounding there.
right. yeah, I was afraid to say that I don't believe, because some of them are literally afraid, especially if you belong to the lesbian gay community. You could be thrown out into the streets. You could be thrown into the streets for not believing in God. So when they have this animosity towards religion, I understand it, right? And just like I also see Christians have animosity towards atheists, because some of them are, could be just as bad as any religion. So I take all these things into account. So I don't mind when someone said, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with that religion. I will talk to them and say, hey, there's some good things that can come of it. Or they continue to brand all Christians a bad way. And
Understandably so.
yeah, so I don't encourage that, but at the same time, I don't deny it from both ends.
Sure. Are you familiar with the moral exemplar uh, theory of salvation or atonement?
No.
It's the idea that Jesus' excellent example, the most moral example or exemplar, was what makes humans righteous. And
Hmm.
so the more we attempt to be like Jesus, the more likely we are to find ourselves on God's good graces, I guess. I mean, you could think about it a lot of different ways, whether that's really how God views us or whether it just happens because of being like Jesus or whatever. But I think the further I get away from evangelicalism, where it's all about the belief structure that you might happen to have, did I say the
Hmm.
right words? Did I pray the sinner's prayer properly or whatever? The more the moral exemplar theory of atonement bubbles a little bit higher than the other ones,
Hmm.
even though I think it's so complicated that you can't really pin it down from what's in the Bible. But the whole idea that being like Jesus has its own very inherent benefits to us in whatever eternal pieces there are in us.
Hmm.
So,
So
um,
that lends itself to going back to my friend Tracy, who was the one I called, the most Christian, non-Christian I know. Think about somebody on the other side of the planet, right? Or even myself. I don't believe. Suppose that I pass away and there is God, right? And I go and I'm meeting Him. I wouldn't think somebody who's omnipotent is really going to say to me, "Hey, I see what you're doing here." And I'm being sincere. I'm being very, very honest. I don't like Pascal's wager. Where I'm going to just believe just in case.
yeah, yeah,
I think that would be disingenuous.
yeah.
Um, so
Understand why.
yeah. So I still don't believe that there's an afterlife. Uh, and I'm not hedging my bets. I'm not trying to be good just in case. Um, I just think it benefits us. It benefits us all to treat each other with decency, respect, and love. Uh,
I think I've probably shared it in a form that you've read, but this example of C.S. Lewis' story in The Last Battle, where Aslan, after they all get to this kingdom of heaven, which for them is Aslan's kingdom, and they're wandering around amazed at the beauty of this place, and they come upon a soldier who is of the enemy's camp, and they're trying to understand how this enemy soldier who served the demonic character and
mhm.
the anti-Aslan could be in that heavenly place. And Aslan says to him, well, all the things that you thought you were doing for this other god that were righteous, I took as service to me. And I think that's interesting, but there's also another category which doesn't require one to be trying to serve an enemy. I think it's as opposed to the being the demonic servant, as opposed to the
Mhm.
Christian servant. I think there's the good moral person that God says these acts, and I think Jesus talks to that in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and he's like, all these things that you didn't even know were for me when you did these for the least of them. I accepted that as service to me, and so now I realize that most evangelicals would take a discussion like we're having and saying, well, he's still going to hell because he didn't say the right thing.
Mhm.
Um, like you said a few minutes ago, I think that's probably rather simplistic.
Right.
And yes,
And
there's a benefit to serving other people.
yeah,
Period.
and something that I don't know. Someone may find this. I don't know how they're going to find this part of the story, but I'd say back maybe 2007, 2006, we're going to this church, and this one guy was insistent, that I be baptized because I wasn't fully, even though I accepted Jesus Christ, I had to be baptized. And I remember at that time, kind of, in that case, kind of going through the motions. But regardless, yeah. But that taught me something too. When I think back at a time when I see some people who, uh, um, okay, so you have a child, right? And they want it baptized, but it's their child. And let's say you're the mother-in-law or whatever, or you're the one that wants to baptize them. And you're so much against it because I've seen atheists. There's the prime example of what I'm talking about. An atheist that is married to a theist, and they want to do something, and they're like, no, don't do that because. I'm like, what does it matter if you don't believe? It's just water. And by the way, it's something else I do want to bring up is my wife. So my wife is a theist, and I'm an atheist. We've been together for 37 years, and we've never had an issue. I think part of the reason, because neither one of us forces that on the other. When she wanted to go to church, I wasn't like, no, you're not going to go. And when I'm an atheist, she doesn't come to me and say, oh, are you going to hell? You're going to, no. We have mutual respect for our beliefs. And even as I stopped believing and she wanted to go to church, I accompanied her because I care about her. Just like my mom and sister. I'm not just going to humor them either. I love them. I want to spend time with them. And I feel that I have things that I can learn from others, which is why I go. And
Yeah.
why if I go to somebody's house and they ask me, hey, would you like to go to church with me? Yeah, gladly.
I'm tempted to say that you're not a typical atheist, but I think what we already established at the very beginning of this is there's no such thing, just like there's no such thing as a
Right.
typical Christian. So
Exactly.
you're Diego. I guess one of the questions I want to ask, and this seems like a good time to do it, you've talked a lot, I think, about what an atheist can gain from being around a religious culture. What's the flip side of that? What do you think a Christian could learn from someone who's a non-theist or an atheist?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I see is the humanizing aspect of it. Yes, you and I were friends. We started playing soccer together on a soccer field. And then it went to the professional thing. And then I think one of the best things that happened between us is that we friended each other on Facebook. And so here you are, something politically and religiously very different, but I still didn't know you as a person, really. I mean, you were my friend and acquaintance, but then you and I started going back and forth, and I feel you are like my friend Pierre, the one that was teaching that class. We have a difference of opinion, but we can still respect each other as just human beings. So, okay, so here's the thing to say this. It doesn't mean that if you approach an atheist, he's going to be open, Keep in mind what I said, that they may not be. So, and so I think what they can learn from an atheist, this idea, first of all, that, oh, you're an atheist, so what keeps you from raping? What keeps you from murdering? Ask them. You may be surprised at their answer. It's not what you may think. So just like I learn things when I go to church, other churches, speak to other people, you can always learn something from someone, however different. As long as they're not attacking you, that's a little different.
But, I'll humorously point out that, look, what destroyed you all along was listening to Carl Sagan, and see, that was the whole problem, and that was what made you become an atheist, and that's exactly what those evangelicals said would happen if you listen to someone talking about it. And if you start talking to an atheist and you find out they're a decent person, maybe that'll break down your walls about Christianity, and then you'll end up deconstructing and
Mm-hmm.
it's all fear-based. That's the thing.
Right. And
Not
I
at all.
still have, and I still have loved ones, family who think I'm going to hell. Uh, and I don't take offense either. Okay. I respect your belief. You believe this. Um, I don't go around making. I mean, sometimes you joke and stuff, but it's just a joke. About when you die, you're going to be shocked. Or no, you're not going to know anything because you're going to be. You know what I mean? That's just little friendly banter, but we don't. Um, anyway, you see what I'm saying?
Do you think the world is a better place because of just in general religion?
So one time I was with my son, and we were talking about ghosts, and I don't remember the exact thing he said to me, but he said, Dad, do you think if no one had come up with a ghost, don't you think somebody would have come up with it? And I thought, yeah, that's a good point. So I think that religion or people in general or groups are a reflection of the people, not the so like I wouldn't point to Christianity and say Christianity is inherently bad, or Islam, or even an atheist. I don't think they're inherently bad. If you have a group of people, like the Christians and the Muslims that are radicalized, for instance, why would they be more open to being radical, right, than let's say another group? Part of the reason I think I have thought about that is whenever you have a religion that does have these very dogmatic, very certain, like you must believe this, you have to believe that. Whereas another religion says, well, like especially Buddhism, you can take it or leave it. It's up to you. But if you don't, it's not about going to hell. It's not about me saving you from going to hell. Then there is no motivating factor to try to convert me or try to force me. And a lot of people
Mhm.
try to force other people into their belief system. So it's kind of like a complicated question because I see the good and the bad. It's again, it's a reflection of the people, and so because you can take anything and just subvert it. You look at Europe, with the Nazis. Look what the radicalism that they had, and that wasn't religious based. Um, and then I don't believe though, and this goes back to what my son said. If you were to somehow eliminate all religion, it would manifest. It would come out in some other form, and part of the reason is the idea that I have to have an answer. I think
Right.
for me that was a big thing too. Like, you know what? I don't know what this is, uh, but I'm going to. It's that. You just said you didn't know what that was. So why are you inserting? You can say it could be that, or maybe it's God. But when you throw in that certainty, like a UFO, unidentified flying object, uh, I don't know what it is, but it's an alien. It's kind of the same thought process because I think we humans don't like a vacuum.
Yeah.
Um, so I and I also don't agree when sometimes people say, "Hey, that thing, no one will ever know. Like we will never know that." I don't believe that either. There are a million things that people in the past thought we'll probably never know that, and here we are knowing it.
Yeah.
So is there a way to confirm an afterlife? Maybe there is. I maybe
Yeah.
you know
Probably not.
yeah. And something else about an atheist. There's this guy Alex O'Connor. He's an atheist, and I was listening to him. He says, and he was asked, so based on everything you believe, do you believe there's anything that you could be told or any proof that would make you believe? And he goes, no, I don't think so. And so, see, there's an atheist right there. Very smart guy. And I think you got to be kidding me. You try and tell me if God materialized right in front of you, that paranormal thing, that you don't believe in, and he's talking to you and he tells you, hey, I'll prove it to you. And then you tell him, hey, okay, prove it to me. And he proves it to you. Are you really going to tell me that you just said you would not accept anything? So to me, I thought as an atheist, he's incredibly closed minded,
Hmm.
to have said that nothing would so I'm looking for proof too. Unfortunately for me, unfortunately I say it's because my mom. The idea that a feeling, right? And to me, feelings are not. Uh,
trustworthy.
reliable enough. No, absolutely not. You know,
I,
so
yeah.
feelings don't factor into, you know, I have this feeling that it's right. So many people thought, and I heard this on the radio. This one lady was talking about how, you know, there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and she says, no, I don't believe it because I feel it in my heart. Or Latter-day Saints do that quite a bit about their prayer, you know, and if you pray honestly, you'll have this feeling. Well, a lot of people have feelings that the earth was going to, you know, be destroyed, and they commit suicide, and then the earth wasn't destroyed. So anyway, that's my benchmark. You know, somebody else can have another, and that's okay if your benchmark is that, and you want to use that as your proof. I don't necessarily have a problem with it. It's just, you know, respect the fact that I don't, and I accept that you do.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So one of the things you touched on about radicalism, I did want to pull that thread a little bit. Um, I think there's certain religions that tend to lead them, world religions that tend to lend themselves more to uh, violent radicals. Certainly
Hmm.
Christianity on the fringes, and then Islam on the fringes. I did a little research last night, and it seems like there's religious extremists in several of the other religions, just not quite as common.
Right.
Um, why do you think Christianity and Islam tend to that more than the others? Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I think from what I was saying before about this, when you have an entire section of the Bible talking about the end times, and you can, you know, interpret that a number of ways, that lends itself to, you know, this thing that we need to conform to that,
Okay.
or even the thought of, hey, if you die, you're gonna go to heaven. There's gonna be 72 virgins. Well, what's the matter with, you know, a suicide bomber, for instance, right? What's wrong with that? You're going to be rewarded. And the same thing can be said about Christians too. I've heard that, you know, about doing this thing and sacrificing. Where I draw the line is when you're sacrificing yourself to kill a bunch of other people, like that doesn't, you know, it doesn't square well with me. So
Well, I mean, from a Christian perspective, I think you could argue that that's desirable in one sense, but I think the better argument would be not forgetting that we're supposed to believe that all humans are made in God's image, and so if you're killing
mhm,
other humans,
right.
you're destroying something that God created in God's image, and that is evil, even if the goal was good.
Hmm.
Um, and there's been a lot of chatter on my circles in the last few days since there's been, I think, 5 executions in the United States of convicted criminals
Hmm.
just in the last week. And they're pointing out that America is one of the last large nations that still executes criminals
I
because we've kind of given up on the idea of rehabilitation and
yes, and
forgiveness in the name of justice.
I'm so glad you brought that up because you talked to me about, you know, the right. I wouldn't say that's radicalization, but the reflection of its population. When you look at, yeah, our penal system, you know, incarcerations, the way we think about somebody that did something, you know, hey, throw them under the the, the prison, you know, throw away the key. And then I look at Germany where they actually try to rehabilitate. I remember I was reading this book one time. I think it was in Finland or something, and this guy was
Yeah,
talking
I've
about their
seen
prison
videos
system.
about that. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, but in this particular case, it was there was a somebody for murder, I think, or something like that, and the sentence was 25 or 30 years, and to them, that was like horrendous, and to them, it's like, do you know what 25, 30 years of your life is? That is a huge chunk of your life. So to them, the punishment is not proportional, like, even though it could even be murder. Like, but if you're actually trying to rehabilitate, and I think in this country, I hate to say this, but we do not try to rehabilitate. It's like
No, no,
punish you, and to me, a lot of that comes from the Bible. To
I
be
agree.
honest, so
Because
you know,
because we formulated a belief structure around retributive justice as
hmm,
opposed to restorative
right,
justice.
right,
And I think that came out of some of the belief systems that came into America
hmm,
from Europe. Um, Puritanism was a pretty ugly religious structure when you tear apart and look at it closely and some of the stuff that it led to in the United States, there was a lot
Hmm.
of pretty significant persecution of non-believers in the Puritan systems. And some of that thinking, it's a long way from the Anabaptist thinking, which was harshly suppressed by those same Puritans. Um, so,
Hey,
yeah, I mean,
I
we
wanted to
could go
ask
on these
you.
topics like forever, couldn't we?
Yeah, but I did want to ask you something because one of the things I've noticed in I've seen a lot of your interviews too and stuff, and I know quite a bit about you now. So one of the things that I sort of been meaning to ask you is there are times when you spoke about this from a political standpoint and also from a religious, where you didn't want to address that, right? You heard something, hey, that doesn't feel comfortable, and so you weren't ready to address it.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the question you asked me, I kind of want to ask you. So for me, when I had no issues when it came to the belief that, okay, there's no afterlife and there's no God, I had no problem, except I want to repeat when I say that. I'm stating that from a probability standpoint, it's so close that I'm going to say I'm an atheist, but I'm not saying that for sure I know. But in your case, if you ever came to the point where you yourself say, you know what, I think I've changed my mind on this, and there is no God, and there's no afterlife. How, like, do you think you would be changed in such a way? Because I've heard you say a couple times, well, that's not good. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I don't think you're going to turn into a murderer.
No.
You know what I mean? But I don't know. I'm just kind of curious. Now you've talked to
So
me and you talked to others too, I'm sure. But
I've been through an interesting journey in the last about a year because I've been in this journey of rethinking all of my foundational belief structures for about 3 years now.
Mhm.
And uh, just in the last 6 months to a year, as I've been re-engaging emotionally at a church, which is very different from the one I used to attend, finding myself in this place where I can sit in a situation where I completely disagree with some of the theology and the details of what are being discussed about how people think the Bible, what it means, and
Mhm.
what the takeaways ought to be. Singing a song that's full of theology that I just completely disagree with, talking about going to heaven instead of hell, and what the particulars are of salvation or eschatology, the end times, and things like that. And I can sit in those situations and still be uh, just like you, sitting in a LDS church, for example, comfortable with being with the people that are there and the spirit that underlies it, not in the religious sense, but the
Mhm.
human sense.
Mhm.
And I have I was telling a story last night at a meeting about the worship team and found myself overcome with emotion at my interpretation of my role in this world with respect to what I believe of as God. And that's striking to me that despite uprooting pretty much every foundation block that I have about the interpretation of things that are biblical or not, um, I'm still able to live and exist in those spaces and be comfortable with a belief in a God that looks very, 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 very unlike anything that I grew up with, and not feel like I have to reconcile that anymore. So the book
Mhm.
Faith After Doubt, which you were part of our book study, and thinking through the different stages of faith, um, going from needing that black and white certainty to being okay with some flexibility and complexity in it, to being a sense of, well, I really can't know, a very agnostic Christianity, to this sense of being in the space of it doesn't really matter to me so much anymore which of those three things are really right or wrong, because I'm kind of floating above needing to settle that question in any way, shape, or form and being okay with that. And so I think for this stage in my journey, I don't need to come up with an answer.
Mhm.
And it's not feeling like I've been given the task, whether by God or my own mind or whatever, of settling anything about God's existence. There are things like capital punishment, which I think is one of those things that, just having watched my own internal responses to what I saw happen this week, and the guy that was executed, who'd even the prosecutor said, we don't think he's guilty. He should not execute him until we've looked at this data closer. Seeing my responses to that tells me that that's something that is now in my bucket of things that have to be stirred and, understood much deeper than I've ever before. Like, what does the Bible really say about this? What does the entirety of my understanding about the nature of the divinity and not just what the Bible says, but how does that all actually play out in humanity? Almost looking at it from a secular perspective, not just a Christian perspective, and what's best for humanity, and what would be the most like being like Jesus in this case, regardless of whether I want to put the label Christian on that. All those things, I think, are at the point in my life where, okay, now that issue has been added to my, now you need to understand this, bin. And if my belief in God ever reaches that point, then I'll deal with that at that time. But what I sense in myself at the moment is I'm quite comfortable with continuing to believe, even though what I believe in probably looks very non-Christian to most of my evangelical growing up mates. And that's okay with me, because kind of floating around in that third, fourth stage, I don't care, because it's not satisfying any one other human's message about whether I'm right or wrong. Just like you, if someone says you're going to hell, it rolls off your back.
Right.
Because you've reached a state of comfort with where you exist in that spectrum of belief structures.
Right.
And so I'm kind of at that point where the same, and I think you might have read one of my blog posts about the Bible verse about, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. And I'm going to use the label God, brought me to that in 3 successive steps a few years back, 3 years or so ago, where first it was just like, this is not just about your wife anymore. This is about, your relationship with other people around you in the faith.
Yes.
You need to separate yourself from satisfying. It's not just about your mom and dad, it's about them. And then it was not just the people in the church, it was about the church organization. And then it was even larger than that. And it's like God was continually asking me to remove myself from caring what other people thought about my relationship with the divine. And that was a very slow and painful process, but at the end of it, it freed me from feeling like what a given sect of the church says about my theology really is not relevant to me anymore. I can learn from it, just like you can sit in a Christian church or a Mormon church, or you can probably go to any kind of Islam or Buddhist or whatever situation and learn something from it. I feel like that's kind of the place that I'm getting to, because, and this is a very Richard Rohr kind of a thing. God, if God identifies as love, what we're really after then is love and not a deity.
Yes. Right.
Being lovers of our fellow humans in the deepest, truest sense. If we want to call that a Christian God, then we're serving God. If we want to call that Allah or the Buddha or whatever, I think we can all begin to move towards that. And it's a heretical way of speaking for an evangelical, but I think Rohr and others like him are onto something. It's just, for me, the hard part is mentally separating myself from the language that I grew up using to begin to incorporate, I think, the things that Jesus really was talking about when you step back from what we wrapped around it. And I think Jesus was talking to those things. And so if we're following that way of being in the world, and the early Christians called themselves followers of the way. It wasn't about being a mini Jesus, a little mini Christ, a Christian. It was about following Jesus' way of being in the world. And I think we find ourselves, a lot of us who are deconstructing, getting to that point. And I think you kind of live in that same realm without calling yourself a follower of the way, but you're doing the
Hmm.
same things that I'm doing. Um, so I find a lot more commonality between the two of us than I do with a lot of my former evangelical friends, because I think in a very practical sense, we're trying to follow the way that Jesus' example set for us,
Hmm.
regardless of what label we happen to
Right.
adopt and what we think the consequences of that will be might vary between us. So, a long monologue, but I mean, that's kind of where I come down to answer that one simple question you asked.
Hmm.
In a nutshell,
Um,
I don't need to satisfy anyone anymore. And at the point when God says, figure this out, then I'll figure that out.
yeah. Yeah. One thing too, just going back to the funny thing is, once I was not only a Christian, if anything, I'm like more anti-war. I
Mm-hmm.
I, I found, and by the way, I'm not saying that Christianity was making me those things, but this goes back to the question about, hey, when you come across an atheist, this concept, because I hear it all the time. You don't have. I'm not saying this ain't to me. I see videos of debates and other things, and that label of how you would somehow self-destruct or be
Your morals
destructive.
would fall off a cliff because you weren't
Hmm.
threatened by hell anymore.
Yeah, yeah. You know something else too. Just as an aside, going back to my wife thing, I remember this clearly. Ephesians 5:25 talks about how a man is supposed to, love, care for his wife, and then there's a passage of what a woman supposedly is supposed to do, and I have no idea what that says, because to me, this is the part that I'm supposed to be looking at. And I think part of the problem, when we talk about Christianity, some of the things is a guy will come and say, hey, look at that, what that says over there about you. Well, you shouldn't be doing that. And I say this because, the thing about continuing my relationship with evangelicals, other, theists like yourself, the book club that we belong to, oh my goodness, I've learned so much, and I'm here with a group of up to 8 people. I'm the only atheist. All of you are welcoming. All of you listen to what I have to say. I listen to what you have to say. We all respect each other. So, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to call religion, walks of life, you can see it's possible, you know, to coexist with very different belief systems and respect and learn from each other. So, and one of
Yeah.
the biggest things I learned from that is what we talked about in one of our last books, that, people look at the Bible, and instead of looking at it and saying, okay, I see myself here, I see here, here, here. Okay, I need to work on that. Usually it's, here's the Bible. Oh, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. Exactly. Yeah. So that's part
Yeah.
of, and that has nothing to do with I don't think that has anything to do with the religion itself. That is you choosing to be outward and forcing you follow these rules. And the whole thing, hey, you need to do that, but I'm the exception.
Yeah. Let me put a pin in the whole discussion and end with this kind of thought that about what you just said. Um, I think one of the character traits uh, of like an evangelical worldview is the idea that we have to fit other people into a particular mold so that the kingdom can come
Hmm.
and the end can come about and we can all be one. Because then God shows up and makes everything right, and now we get to be in heaven on earth, and everything's good, and the lion will lay down with the lamb, and swords beaten into plowshares, and all those things. And I think the irony is that my current sense is that it's almost the opposite, that we have to step back from that evangelical worldview to be able to live with other people that are very different from us and be followers of the way in whatever way that looks, because then there really does chance this opportunity for us to become one, like you and I have become close friends despite our radical differences in certain ways, that to most Christians would say absolutely disqualifying. You can't really be friends with someone like that because,
Hmm.
or atheists would say the same about you. And maybe if we step back from those
Yep.
hardcore uh, wing, left or right or left wing or whatever, but fringe, radical, I guess would be the right word,
Hmm.
positions, then we can actually start to find ways to coexist with people who are very different than us and maybe see that oneness come about that Jesus was pointing to in John 17. But I think we all need and we all recognize we're working through this book on what's going on in the Middle East right now. And
Hmm.
that will never be solved by more warfare, will it?
No,
The only way
quite
we
the
can
opposite.
the only way we can ever see that being resolved is by people setting aside radicalism of both kinds.
Yep.
And so I don't think that's I don't think that's a need to stop being religious
Right.
or Christian or Jewish or Islamic or whatever the thing is. I think it's maybe trying to see what parts of those different religions are the ones that are toxic,
Hmm.
that leads to the radicalization and prevent us from becoming one, and recognizing that even if you worship under a different banner or different label, if you're following that way of bringing more love into the world for each other, then we should be able to coexist a little bit better regardless of what label we use.
Hmm.
So we could have more hour. I'm sure you and I will over the.
You and I could talk for days about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this again because I'm sure we can come
Hmm.
up with another couple topics that are worth pursuing. And the chance to talk to someone different than me has been a joy of my life for the last few years. And so for that, I thank you.
Thank you as
So we'll
well.
talk again soon, and I will see you for book study next week.
Yes.
All right. Take care, sir.
Bye bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I certainly did. Each time I talk to Diego, I feel like I grow a little bit more. And he and I agree that there are plenty more topics that would be worth discussing together. As we touched on at the end of the conversation, I think we share a lot of goals for our world and the people in it. And the more that we can do to find ways to do that good work together, the better. So thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Bye-bye.